Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about good books. Yes, it's weekend, and weekend means reading something else than Wheel of Time. And what I just read was Lovecraft Country by Matt Ruff from 2016. I have not watched the show. We're going to talk about the book today. And yeah. We'll see how that goes. I'll give like a short rundown of what it is about, and then we'll go into like spoiler discussions, by which I mean I'll talk about things that I think are important about it and why you all should go and read it. I mean, you all should go and read it. It's fantastic. That's that. I will reference the works of H.P. Lovecraft at some point, definitely. I will also reference some other pulp authors. I have read a lot of their stuff. I've read like basically all of Lovecraft's, and if you want me to actually talk about Lovecraft as well, let me know in the comments, and we can certainly get that started. I would have to do like a full reread to actually, feel qualified though, so that might take a couple of days, I guess. Anyway, that's all of that. Time to say thank you to a new Patreon backer, like a new patron. Holly, thank you for becoming a backer, and this one's for you. Cheers. All right, now let's look at what is Lovecraft Country. Lovecraft Country is, well, it's it's a story about horror in the 1950s, and it's written like a collection of pulp short stories that are then built into a larger novel. In that regard, it's very similar to what we spoke about recently, right? Both Pavan by Keith Roberts and A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller Jr. are both what you might call fix-up novels, right? They have like some tradition, especially in the times where stuff was published in magazines first and then later maybe collected into a novel or like an actual volume, and then you'd build, try to connect those things a bit more and whatnot. So this has a certain tradition, and Matt Ruff is, well, obviously he's like imitating or nodding to or paying homage to this tradition of the pulp story, the pulp stories that then form a larger narrative. That's the first thing. So this is very much conscious about the stories that it is commenting on. It's literature about literature is what you might call it. And it focuses on pulp stories, especially the Lovecraft and, the weird talesy kind of pulp stories of the 1930s, with some like lots of nod bags to Edgar Rice Burroughs, both the Barsoom Martian stuff and the Tarzan, but mostly Barsoom, the Martian, the Princess of Mars, John Carter of Mars stuff. It does all of that, but it uses the lens of racism in the 1950s, making all the main characters, or viewpoint characters, all people of color. And that's an important aspect to it, and that's the other bit why I think this is an important book that you all should read, and we'll get back into details in a minute, is it does comment on the problem that a lot of pulp stories had in the 1920s, 1930s, and all the way into, the 50s and 60s, but, and that is, it was mostly literature written for and by white men. Yes, there are a few women. We'll talk about C.L. Moore's wonderful Black God's Kiss at some point. I have a friend who I really want to have on for that conversation, so we need to schedule that stuff. Anyway, most of it is written by white men, written for white men, or like from their cosmos, right? So looking at it through the lens of racism and the lens of, how people of color deal with that kind of stuff makes it unique and absolutely important. It's obviously not the end of the discussion about racism and the pulps, but it is, I think, a very valuable, contribution. So that's a reason why you should read it. Now let's look at the actually most important one. Those stories are absolutely insanely good. All of them. There's like 8 stories in there, and they're all fantastic. They're really good. Like, all of them work as individual adventure pulp stories. They're crazy good. The main characters are extremely well developed. it is certainly, and this is where you can like notice that it is a modern work. The prose is more readable than a lot of like 30s pulp prose. The characters are multidimensional, fantastic. The actual stories are really cool. They have that over-the-top flair that you expect from pulp stories. It's just so much fun to read this book, despite all the darkness in it. So yeah, do yourself a favor. Go pick up that book. It's short. It's got like 450, 500 pages, something like that. It's like, it's not even half a Malazan book is what I'm saying here. So yeah, go get the book, read it, and then come back and we can talk about the rest. It will be slightly spoilery, but mostly thematic. So if you don't care about spoilers, you can also just stick around. Great, you're back. Wonderful. How was the book? I hope you liked it. Now let's look at a bunch of things that I feel are important about this book. And let's start with the first one. We'll slowly build it up. Let's start with the first one, and that is certainly that this is a very modern book. You look at like Matt Ruff's writing style, while it is a fairly straightforward style compared to your like over-the-top floral prose kind of Gene Wolfe's or Neil Stephenson's at this point, your Thomas Pynchon's, whatever. Now this is a very straightforward language, which makes a lot of sense because we're talking about the pulps that also had a fairly straightforward kind of prose. It is, however, a very modern prose. We don't get like long lists of adjectives like we get with, your Robert E. Howards or H.P. Lovecraft's. Also, the characters are very, very written in a very modern or contemporary literary style. They are far more than just two-dimensional cliches. And unfortunately, most, not all, but most pulp characters are just that. John Carter is just brave and upstanding and noble and manly, very manly, of course. All of them are very manly. And so forth. Conan, while having some depth, is still a very straightforward character. Like most characters in these kind of books are that. These characters here in Lovecraft Country are contemporary characters. They have their facets. They are multidimensional. They have their fault lines. They're not perfect. They have breaks and like all these edges that real human beings have. And that's one of the main things that I love about this book, and that I think Matt Ruff shows that you can write a pulp story, like a really cool pulp story, adventure story, with all the fun things about pulp, but still put in that human factor that a lot of the pulp characters, lack. They don't feel like fully human. These characters feel fully human. And at the same time, there is a sympathy of the author for those characters. None of those characters are written, like someone looking down on them or something. It's wonderful in that regard. And I think, as I said, what we get here is, on the one hand, a love letter to pulp stories in general, which, yeah, do that. They're great. But on the other hand, it is very conscious of all the failings of that specific genre. And I think the characters are one of the best parts to do that. Another thing is, I said that before, is like Matt Ruff understands his subject matter there. He talks about pulp stories, and each of those stories that we have in here is modeled after one specific subgenre of your pulp stories. There's the first story, Lovecraft Country, is pretty close. It is more like your typical Lovecraft trip gone horribly wrong kind of story. Your Shadow over Innsmouth kind of story. If someone goes somewhere in the middle of nowhere, reaches this weird old town where people are really strange and weird, and has some sort of adventure, like horrific adventure there with some supernatural component and an ancient order doing something. It's clearly built on that model, but adds, of course, the aspects of racism. We're going to come back to that again and again, and I guess this is a point where I need to say I am not the best person to talk about this, because I have literally no experience of this. Not as a white man in the US, and even much less as a black person. I all my knowledge, all my experience of American racism towards black people in, the wake of slavery, which is a huge, background thing here in this book. It comes from reading books and watching movies, from consuming media. So I'm whatever I say here comes from that perspective, and there are much better perspectives out there, I am sure of it. And I'm always willing to listen to those whenever I encounter them. So that's just said at this point. But this first one deals, and I think this is one thing that you can see as a through line through these stories. Each of these short stories, while, paying homage to a specific subgenre of the pulps, also showcases a specific aspect of racism against black people in the 1950s America, and of course also in the 1930s and beyond, but you know what I mean. And this one is certainly the one that connects most with slavery, and the idea that black people are still kind of thought of as property that can be pushed around and used as sort of property by rich white people. That's sort of the racist part of this story. Plus, of course, we've got a first mention of sundown towns and the idea of lynching people or just shooting people in the middle of nowhere because you're a fucking racist, which, happens a lot in this story. So the threat of, the actual threat of death and being used as property is the big theme in this one. Plus, of course, the supernatural bit there, which, it's handled, both of those are handled extremely well, in my opinion. So that's great. We move on to Dreams in the Witch House, which obviously is a Lovecraft reference, and becomes something of a haunted house story, which, the Dreams in the Witch House is also. It's one of the better Lovecraft stories, I feel, Dreams in the Witch House. But this one is, pretty cool. And we switch characters. We have, other issues here. Like, the big main issue here is that even after, all kinds of laws were passed in the 50s, the idea that it's very difficult for people of color to move into a white neighborhood. All the, harassment and hatred and threats that come with that, all the fights back that go, pass below the level of being, pursued by the by the police and the law, and the fact that you were still treated as a second-class person. And that kind of meshes wonderfully with the theme of that, ghost in that house being, well, also pretty fucking racist, It works wonderfully well in that regard, and it looks at a different aspect of the whole corpus of the weird tales pulp stories, and in that regard, is another classic and does that wonderfully well. While, as I said, pointing out that that part of discrimination. Now we move on to another one which I also appreciate, and that is Abdullah's book, I think, unless I missed one, which is basically a heist adventure story with someone creeping somewhere, trying to find something. In this case, they're forced, our main characters are forced to find or steal a book out of a secret room in a museum. And that's another one of those typical, pulp stories. It's more like the thing you might see in a Robert E. Howard, right, than an H.P. Lovecraft. The break-in into, a museum to steal a magical book. I mean, magical books are, of course, a staple of the Cthulhu mythos and those kind of pulp, weird talesy kind of stories. And this one does the same thing. Just once again, showcasing all kinds of aspects of, also racism and the way that black people are treated there, the way they have to hide from all kinds of things, and how through that they are also forced to build their parallel societies because they're not admitted into a general society, which is why you have that Masonic lodge there that all those black people are in. And that's, it's a cool one. It's an adventure story. It's not as dark as the others, I feel, while still being dark, don't get me wrong. There's still death and mystery and it once again showcases, I feel, an aspect that we see in that time, and that is also built back to what we see with our like sort of like first main character, that being Atticus Turner, who is a black. He used to be a soldier. He's a veteran from the Korean Wars, and the idea that white America was very, very happy to have you know, black soldiers fight their wars in overseas and die for them and put them in places of, you know, use them as cannon fodder, basically, which is exactly what our sort of our wizard here, Caleb Braithwaite, is doing. He's using those people to get what he wants because he's afraid he might hurt himself. So that, yeah, it adds that aspect to it. Now we go to, you know, there's more stories in there. There's the wonderful one that is that I really absolutely love, that is Hippolyta Disturbs the Universe, which is more an homage to what you might call your sci-fi, your pre-spaceship sci-fi stories. Something that either an H.P. Lovecraft or particularly a Clark Ashton Smith would write, when you find a machine that allows you to step to a different place, to a different planet on the other end of the world, and you see that one, and it deals with other aspects, like how it was, even though it was, you know, legal and whatnot, illegal and all of these kind of things, how difficult life and like aspirational life for people of color was in those times. Our main character Hippolyta here wanting to become an astronomer, and how difficult it was for a colored person of color to may start a career in academia in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and so forth, and having that aspect to it, which, you know, once again, fantastic story dealing with all kinds of aspects of that. But this, I feel, is the big one, and this one is like the casual like disadvantage that people of color, obviously also other groups that are, you know, economically disadvantaged and less privileged, suffer from, but in particular those are connected with race, obviously. So yeah, you have that aspect to it. It's still like really cool, like adventure story with a bit of cosmic horror thrown in for good measure, of course, you know, because we need that, right? So great story there as well. We have Jekyll in Hyde Park, which deals with, you know, the general treatment of white, preferred treatment and white privilege that you see in like everyday life, with our main character here being Ruby, who is not as, you know, actively fighting racism like some of the other characters in these stories. And, you know, just dealing with how, you know, the figure of like especially black women are discriminated against, and also adding that idea of like the fetishization of black women by white men at some point. Yeah, but all of these aspects in it, and it's also obviously modeled after the whole like Jekyll and Hyde story, with someone getting the chance to be someone else, and the question like, what does that to you? Is it still you? Is it still the same person? And you just like get a way to get away with your darker impulses, or is this really someone else? It asks all those questions, and you get a lot of those stories. I mean, obviously the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde story being like the model for it, but you get like similar stories in the pulps as well. It does that part really well. You move on, you have obviously you know, the Mark of Cain story, which is another like heist and whatnot, and the Horace and the Devil Doll story, and where our kid Horace, who's very much thinking in comic books, and we see that impact, and we go and talk about that in a second, right? When we have someone talking about how like white media, mostly made for white people, is still impacting, is still getting you, is still, you know, being consumed and has an impact on, you know, discriminated against like groups, racial groups, right? Where people, black kids also read comics, and what does it do to them when they don't see any black, you know, heroes and superheroes and whatnot? Which I guess, you know, ties back into like a very, very, you know, current contemporary debate on woke Marvel and whatnot, which I'm not going to go into here right now because I don't feel that's the place for it. Plus, we have, the story, the ghost story, the classic ghost story about the Narrow House, when they go, meet like someone who got actually killed, and their house torched by white supremacists around their house, and are now haunting this, and how you deal with that. Once again, it faces all these aspects, and I think that's very well done. And I really appreciate all of this. So let's go past me just telling you what kind of stories we have, because you've read it at this point. You know what it will be about. And look at like 3 important things here. First, the love for media and how media can be important. Horace, who's writing comic books and drawing comic books, is one of those characters, and it certainly reminded me of The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon, which does a similar thing for Jewish refugees and Jewish kids in 1930s New York, trying to overcome the problems of anti-Semitism by writing comics and dealing with those in comics. And it shows that fantasy, escapist literature in general, can be a way to deal with discrimination for the people suffering from it. Plus, also, through self-inserting and whatnot, you can make these stories your own, even if they were not written with you as the reader in mind. And that's something that we see here, how that plays out, especially, I guess, in the Horace and the Devil Doll story, and with the comics of Ophelia Green, that kind of are this through line with Hippolyta and like other stories as well, especially the what I called Hippolyta Disturbs the Universe, of course, that one. So that's a first thing. Also, you should go and read The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. It's a fantastic novel. It does wonderful things. Now, the difference, obviously, is that, the Jewish self-empowerment through comic books is real. You go and watch, read up on the history of Superman and all these. There is that part. I am not sure how much of that actually ever happened in the 50s or 60s with people of color. I just don't know, because I'm not a comic book kind of guy. All right, that's a first point. It leads me to the second one. That is empowerment. This is a book about empowerment, about breaking out of this conception that you are inferior in some way, that you can be pushed around, that you can do all of these things, and I feel the medium of a pulp story is, or like something inspired by pulp fiction, is exactly the right medium for that. Because a lot of these pulp stories, you're more like your Robert E. Howards than your Lovecrafts, for obvious reasons, are very much about that as well. They're about overcoming insane odds by just being yourself and not letting anyone, push you around. That's what Conan is all about at the end of the day. Because, of all the personal problems that Robert E. Howard had, but we're not going to go into those today either. So having the idea of empowerment, the overarching story is exactly that. When it ends with our combined heroes kicking Caleb Braithwaite out of their turf, out of Chicago, through magical means. That's exactly what this is about. It's about taking your things, Letitia taking over the house, taking over the haunted house, the Winthrop house. That's It's like not letting those people grind you down, leaving on your own, doing your own thing. And breaking free from that past. That's what this story, the whole book is about. And as I said, using the medium of pulp stories or pulp-inspired stories is a wonderful way to do that. And I really appreciate that aspect of it. It's wonderful. Another interesting aspect that we need to look at is, I guess, the white side of things here. And we have a bunch of aspects, facets, or points where that comes through. And the character of Caleb Braithwaite is exactly the important character here, right? He's young, he understands that racism is bad, and that his, elder generation treated those people terribly, and he tries to do what he thinks is right. He pays off that debt. He tries to, save Atticus and all of these things. But at the same time, he has not lost this feeling of superiority, that he can do these things, right? And he does not understand that there is guilt, or that it's a question of conscience. It's not a question of money. It's not a question of, you know, being a bit nicer. It's about actual equality, and he's still not able to accept that all the way to the last page, right? When they kick him out, it's like, well, why are you doing this? I was always nice to you. I was always trying to help, and all of that. It's like, it's not about help. It's about like actually accepting the other as equal. And in that regard, the character of Caleb Braithwaite, I think, is an important character, because he does all of these things, and he's supposedly nice when he treats with Ruby and all of that stuff, right? In mostly Jekyll and Hyde Park. He does all of these things, but yeah, he's still not there. He's still not there. Far from it. But of course, you know, he's also like ultra privileged towards other white men, so there's that aspect in it as well. But I guess that's connected to it, right? You have this idea that a lot of these like high, you know, very privileged people, economically privileged people in the 1950s owe a lot of their privilege to their exploitation of, well, slavery mostly, and later exploitation of black people. And that's another really strong aspect there that I feel might get overlooked easily, because it's so easy to just see him as another bad guy. I feel the aspect that he's trying to be a better person but still not getting it is one that a lot of us can still go and, you know, look at and maybe learn from it and self-reflect and see if we're not maybe succumbing to the same kind of, you know, flaws all the time. Just, you know, an idea. All right, now it's time to talk about the last one, the actual racism problem with Lovecraft, and why it is important to understand how that works. This book is, while dealing with the supernatural as a, you know, as in pulp and horror stories, the actual horror, the actual threat to our characters, our main characters in these stories, are never really, you know, the supernatural, not the different planet. Well, yeah, it's there, but that's never the main threat. The main threat, and where the horror comes from, and there is horror in these books, is always racist discrimination. And that makes it so good, really good, and work. And I'm trying to explain why, and why I think this is important, and like the best way to look at, like, deal with Lovecraft these days. Which brings us to something that I might have to expand upon in a separate Lovecraft video. It is easy to say, and some famous booktubers have said so, that you can separate the art and the artist, even in the case of H.P. Lovecraft, so leave him alone. It's not possible. Don't get me wrong. Like, we can just assume that most white Americans in the 1930s had some racist ideas, subscribed to some racist ideas. That's just part of the times, and that's one thing. H.P. Lovecraft, however, goes beyond that. And it shows in his art. It shows in his stories. Because he uses racism or racist stereotypes as part of his effort to create horror and fear. He uses the fear of the other. And not in, you know, using, you know, ghosts or whatever monsters, but literally people of color, especially what, you know, racist, you know, racial purist that he is and racist that he was, what he calls mixed races. I'm quoting here, right? You know, mixed races, mostly Caribbean origin, so forth. In the Call of Cthulhu, it's exactly that. A lot of the horror is more about like him hating the idea that black people exist, or people of color exist, or that the good Aryan white race will mix their blood. You see the problem, right? And he uses that as part of his horror. So his racism is deeply ingrained in a lot, not all of his, but in a lot of his stories. So flipping that on its head and using, you know, the threat of racism, of actual existing racism, as the main form of horror in these books is exactly the right way to deal with it, because it shows how Lovecraft's works are like deeply racist in a lot of ways. It shows that. in an artistic way and takes the good things of horror, the idea of cosmic horror, which is still a fantastic idea and a huge influence on horror all the way to now. It takes those good things, but it tries to comment, it tries to argue, to deal with the bad sides of it. And we need to get rid of those, we need to get rid of the racist, like, bits in Lovecraft's work. We need to be aware of them, we need to get rid of them. And this, what Matt Ruff is doing here, is one first step in the right direction there. It's a very powerful step, and yeah, if this book doesn't touch you, you're doing something wrong, I guess. It is, however, and this is the next bit there, it is not the end. But yeah, I mean, we see this, like, at the end when he's threatening, when Braithwaite is threatening, you know, our main protagonists with, well, magic and all the magic dangers, and they just laugh at him. So, you know, we're afraid to get shot on the street because we're black. Your wizard don't scare me. And that's like a very, very powerful statement. But it is not the end, because the end, or like the way forward for, like, dealing with the mythos, dealing with the legacy of H.P. Lovecraft, is to read and promote people of color that write in the Lovecraft mythos, that make those stories, that make that world, that make that mythos their own. And I know they exist out there. I've just not looked into it that much yet, because, you know, I got lots to read, and I'm not the biggest Lovecraft fan in the first place. But promoting those people, promoting their look at it, them making it their own, the way Horace is making the white comic book world his own, with a woman of color, Ophelia Green, as the main heroine. That's the way to move forward, to read and promote those artists, which I guess is one of the reasons why having a lot of people of color work on the TV show is the right step there as well, which I have not watched the show, so no comments on it. But, you know, that's where we need to go, because it's their voices, and we don't need white people. At the end of the day, we don't need white people. We should not only rely on white people telling us how bad racism was, and still is. At the end of the day, we need to listen to those people actually suffering from it. But Lovecraft Country, written by Matt Ruff, is a very good first step in that direction, because it made me think, it made me feel bad, and a lot of other things, while still being a absolutely fantastic read. I had a bout of insomnia. I read, like, most of the book in, like, one night. It's that gripping. And I still think it's a super important book. Y'all should go and read it if you haven't yet. And I would love to hear your opinions on all of this. How do you like it? Do you think I should talk about, like, H.P. Lovecraft's work as well? Let me know in the comments. If this was your first time, like, subscribe, share, comment, do all of these wonderful things. And if you want to have, like, me cheering you with a beer, maybe subscribe to the Patreon, but there's no obligations there whatsoever. Anyway, have a great weekend. I'll talk about, Hollow tomorrow, I think, by Brian Catling, which will be a trip. Until then, cheers.